Welcome everyone. You are listening to the new Votes and Seats podcast episode of the Center for Political Science of Mathias Corvinus Collegium. My name is Szabolcs Janik, senior researcher of the center. In today's episode, we will discuss the results and potential political consequences of the recent European Parliament elections. And I have the honor to do so with Emanuele Massetti, professor of the University of Trento. Professor, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Many commentaries and assessments of the EP election have appeared in the last 10 days. What do you find personally the most surprising about the results and why?
With the risk of looking non-modest, I'm not very surprised about the results. They're pretty much in line with my expectations. So, yeah, everything as expected, more or less.
And if you had to summarize the key conclusions, what would you highlight?
I would highlight that the traditional majority of the EU holds their ground, particularly the good results of the EPP and the confirmation of the Social Democrats compensate for the bad results of the Liberals over March. But overall, they maintain a good majority. The other important trends are the bad performance of the Greens and good performance overall of the Conservatives and the Identitarian, particularly if taken together.
And you already mentioned which groups or party families could be deemed winners and which losers.
Yeah, I think the EPP consider themselves as the winner, and the data show that. And new, let's say, parliament assigns them an even more important role that they had before, because they are the pivot party because of the growth of the Conservatives and the Identitarian. And they are still very much the biggest party.
EP elections are traditionally considered so-called second-order elections, which means that interest in voting among the voters is traditionally lower, and the parties attach lower importance to these European elections. What was the political significance of this election, in particular for the voters? How could they perceive the campaigns, the issues?
It's very difficult to answer this question because most of the voters are only interested in the national campaigns, which they can understand because it's run in their own language, and also because politicians tend to speak a lot about national issues. But of course, there could be EU policy issues or issues concerning projects of further European integration that are brought in the national debates, and therefore some voters might have also made their decision on the basis of those issues. But in the absence of individual level data, it's very difficult to say which voters and how many voters decided according to EU or national considerations, or which mix of national and EU considerations. We have to keep in mind that many voters also vote because of party affiliation, not formal affiliation, but let's say partisanship, party ID. And in that respect, the most important dynamic is the level of turnout, the extent to which parties manage to mobilize their loyal electorate and bring them to the polls, particularly in an election like this, which is considered to be a second order. So it's very difficult to say, but I would say the punishment of the Greens signals a certain dissatisfaction with the European Green Deal, even if that policy package was proposed and implemented and voted and implemented by the traditional EU majority. But the name given to the policy package is the name of the Green Party, and the Green Party is also the party that spent itself most in raising the issue of climate change, and the European Green Deal has been presented as a response to, let's say, deal with the problem of climate change. And therefore, the Greens have maybe unfairly considered to be the responsible political force for that policy package, which has not been very popular amongst wide sections of the European population.
And if you had to name further issues that are related to the future of Europe that could motivate voters or had a substantial impact on the results, what could be those dividing issues?
The good results of the conservatives and identitarians could be linked to the issue of migration, because we know from many decades that those parties own the issue of immigration, and citizens, voters who have anti-immigration orientations naturally vote for them, particularly if they give a lot of importance to this policy issue. Not only those who are anti-immigrant, but also those who want a more orderly management of immigration or a more integrationist approach in dealing with the immigrant communities. So that could be a policy areas that explains the good results of the conservatives and identitarians, and also those who are reluctant or perplexed or against further integration probably prefer to give their preference to conservative or identitarian parties, because that's the best guarantee to protect the powers of the state, of the member states, vis-a-vis further transfers of powers to the EU level.
And what about the war in Ukraine? And I'm asking this because in Hungary, governing Fidesz pushed it as the key campaign topic, where it argued for peace against interventionist policies from the side of Europe. How did this issue come up in Western Europe or in other member states? And was there any, or might have been any consequence of these?
My feeling is that this issue is very divisive in Eastern Europe, because it's perceived to be as more important. So if we look at the different trend between Hungary and Poland, maybe even Slovakia and Czech Republic, Bulgaria and Romania, in Central Eastern Europe, this issue is more important, and it is perceived differently within countries and maybe even more across countries. In Western Europe, my feeling is that public opinion is less divided, and there is a sort of consensus in the middle, in the sense that most people support the help that the European Union and NATO is giving to Ukraine, but they do not like escalation. They do not like over-interventionist rhetoric. Wide sections of the populations are a bit tired of bearing the cost of sanctions, which have been let's say they had more negative effects maybe on some parts of Europe than in Russia. And more importantly, they want to see a clear objective, which is at the moment lacking. It is not clear what the objective of NATO and EU support to Ukraine is. What is the exit strategy from this tragic situation?
And if you look at these issues or even others, can these give ground to the emergence of some kind of cleavages? So how polarized is the current European political landscape, in particular the newly elected EP?
There might be a polarizing trend. I don't think it will be primarily related to the war, because the war will last until NATO and Russia will find an agreement. I don't think the EU is a big player on war and peace issues. But if for internal policy and for plans for future integration, there might be a polarizing tendency because the projects put forward by the traditional majority are very ambitious in terms of further integration. And both the conservatives and the identitarian parties are rather adamant in maintaining the veto powers in specific, very sensitive policy areas. So there will be tough confrontation on that area. Plus all the policies that have been divisive so far, starting from the Green Deal, will continue to be as divisive as they were, particularly if the traditional majority goes on without changes and without taking into consideration the electoral advance of the conservatives and the identitarian. So it's up to the EPP to choose which direction to take. And the consideration might be, let's listen to what voters wanted to communicate by punishing the Greens and rewarding the conservatives and the identitarian. Or the other consideration would be, in the next parliament, maybe there could be no other chances of reforming a traditional majority. So let's exploit this last chance to push ahead with integration and with our policy agenda as much as possible.
And turning to your country, Italy, could you very briefly summarize the results and the winners and losers of the election?
Very briefly, the two main winners of the election are the party of the Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, which improved on the national election results, and the main party of the opposition, which belongs to the Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament, a party that has a new leader, Elish Lane, and which consolidated its position within the opposition area, and the new leader consolidated their position within the party, as she was rather criticized by important politicians, both from the regional level and the leaders of the main streams and factions of the party. With this result, I think she consolidated her position. The government as a whole seems to be strengthened because also the government partners of Giorgia Meloni have consolidated their vote share. So the government as a whole has slightly increased their vote share. It remains to be seen the extent to which the negotiations for the new president of the Commission might create divisions within the government, because let's remember that the Italian government is made by a strong member of the Conservatives and two other important components, one in the EPP and one in the Identitarian group. The ideal, maybe probably utopian project of the Italian government was to bring this formula at the EU level. Clearly, this is not possible. So in the Italian case, the kingmaker, the pivot is the Conservative Party, Fratelli d'Italia of Giorgia Meloni. She will have to decide whether to leave out the identitarian and join maybe the EU majority only with their party, or bringing with her the Conservative Party as a whole, if she can negotiate a good deal in that respect, or to remain in opposition with the identitarian and leave the EPP component, which is Forza Italia, the traditional party of Berlusconi, which will be part of the EU majority. So in any way, part of the Italian government will be in the EU majority and part will be in the opposition. And this might create some problems for stability.
You mentioned Meloni's success, which is also relevant in terms of the European level. You also referred to it, and the future fate of the ECR. Let's play with the thought. If you were an influential political advisor to the ECR group, would you recommend them to merge with ID and create a new political family in the European Parliament, or rather stay apart and continue in the next 5 years separated? Which could work out better, which could be good or better, bring more benefits to these two party groups?
It's very difficult to say. I've never been a policy or a political advisor. I see myself as an independent scholar and analyst. So it's difficult to say. The fact that AFD has been expelled from the ID party might be interpreted as a signal that there is a will in both components to join forces. And that outcome would have some consequences in parliamentary politics, because especially if they manage to attract also members from the non-affiliated, then they can become the second parliamentary group. And being the second parliamentary group might change the perception. But in the end, it depends on the negotiation with the other parties and what particularly Giorgia Meloni, but other members of the Conservatives can achieve or not achieve by remaining on their own or merging with ID. So I think the approach will be very, very pragmatic. And as I said, the kingmaker is the EPP. It depends on what they offer to the Conservatives, what the supposed deal will be. And on those bases, the Conservatives will make a choice.
Thank you very much, Professor, for sharing your thoughts about the recent European Parliament elections. And dear listeners, thank you for following our discussion. And please stay tuned for the upcoming Votes and Seats episodes as well. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.